My guest today is Daron Acemoglu. Daron is a professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research focuses on political economy, human capital, wage inequality, and the relationship between technology and growth. He's one of the 10th most cited economists in history, and is best known for his book Why Nations Fail, which argues that institutions are crucial for prosperity and growth.
What have you learned? What are the big lessons about how institutions and governments interact and people interact to produce these very different performances in very different countries?
Well, this has been a distressing time for everybody, but it's also been a time of soul searching for me. Just in September 2019, James Robinson and I published a new book, The Narrow Corridor, where we talk about why democratic governance, liberty, societal involvement in politics are hard things to maintain, and we sort of talk about some of the issues of state capacity. But in some sense, what I realize now is that the situation is even worse than the most negative reading of that framework of that book would suggest. To put it bluntly, I think in 30 years' time, when historians and scholars talk about this era, they will emphasize the colossal policy failures, institutional failures that have both created the environment where the pandemic can do most damage, and also laid the ground for complete inability of institutions in much of the world to deal with them. So in some sense, the sort of fault lines that we tried to talk about in the narrow corridor, A, were much worse, and B, have been hit by a shock that really exploits their weaknesses. And what I have in mind is two things in particular in terms of the fault lines. One is inequality. So, I have always thought inequality creates a lot of social problems, but I had not seen how the health inequality and inequality in access to public health measures, healthcare system, and other support mechanisms would be so badly exploited by a particular shock of this sort. So that's one thing. So when you look at where the deaths are, where the damage is, it's really very, very strongly correlated with people with bad socioeconomic performance over the last several decades, worse health conditions, low access to healthcare. And that there's quite a bit of the difference between, not by any means, and I'll come to that, but quite a bit of the difference, say, between Germany or Denmark and the US and the UK can be explained by those health inequality differences that were pre-existing. But even more ominous, in my opinion, is that this pandemic hit the particular fault line created by the erosion of state capacity. I think the most jarring aspect of this is the CDC. If you look at the CDC,
the Centers for Disease Control for our
Center for Disease Control, which is the first line of defense and second and the third line of defense in the US against pandemics and diseases, infectious diseases. It is an institution that has a illustrious past. It has done very well in a number of different crises. It was ahead of public health measures in the past, even as recently as the Ebola crisis. I think it really got full marks in terms of how quickly it dealt with problems. I mean, it's been a colossal failure. It has been an unmitigated colossal failure. Can you imagine? Look, let's look at this. I think these are facts that we should be screaming about more. Can you imagine an institution that's about infectious diseases, where essentially everybody in that institution, consumes and thinks about disease epidemics and SIR models and things like that before breakfast. And in early January, they get information about a disease that has an R0, basic reproduction number, of almost 3. That has a mortality rate, certainly greater than half a percentage point among the infected. So probably much worse, but probably around that time, around that, if you take the whole population. You see, they should all be panicking and taking measures in early January. And this institution does nothing for 3 months until March. It's unbelievable. It is absolutely unbelievable. And really, I think it's almost criminal. And where does this come from? Well, it comes from probably the incompetence and vicious policy agenda of the Trump administration, combined with erosion of state capacity in these institutions and demoralization, disempowerment. But it is just an incredible situation. This is what you expect from Nigeria, not from the United States.
Let's start with inequality. Inequality between people who can work at home and can't, inequality between information workers who tend to be on the top of the distribution and the bottom, inequality between old and young, inequality between access and non-access. Well, all of these things seem to be not only important, but they seem to be accentuated by the illness and by the epidemic and actually worsened. Is that how you see it? Is this illness?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah, this is an unequalizing crisis. And I also worry that part of the reason why we, the more fortunate ones, are not as exercised about some of the consequences of this crisis is because we're not feeling them. 2 aspects I want to emphasize. Actually, 3 aspects, sorry. One of them we've already said, but I want to reiterate it. The consequences are very much unequally distributed between those who have good health conditions versus those who do not have good health preconditions, which tend to be the poorer people. Second, those of us who are in the global intellectual elite, we're working from home. Our incomes are not disrupted. We're not losing our minds because we're busy Zooming all day in conferences, talks, and stuff. It's the manual workers in the hospitality industry, construction, production, who have lost their jobs. So this crisis, when people talk of the trade-off between economics and healthcare outcomes, they're really not taking into account the distributional aspects of this, which I think is really, really first order. It's not like you're just saving GDP by doing the right economic adjustments. You're actually saving the livelihood of the most vulnerable people in this pandemic. The most vulnerable in terms of health are those with pre-existing with comorbidities and the elderly. So we have to protect them. But there are also tens of millions of very vulnerable economic workers that we have to find ways of dealing with it. And paltry unemployment insurance isn't going to be the solution. We have to find ways of better policy, like testing, tracing, finding smart ways of opening up the economy. The third, I think that's also very important, education. Those who are in good schools, they are continuing to learn through Zoom. Their teachers are adapting. And if you look at people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who were going to schools where their possibility for upward social mobility was already hampered, they're completely stopped learning. It's really tragic what this is going to imply for next generation's educational inequality. And there are essentially 4 futures that are available to us. One is exactly where you started from, which is doubling down on what we have, which is ignore the problem, continue the erosion of institutions. That's exactly what Trump is going to try. And if he wins in November 2020, he will certainly implement that, and in a much speedier way than even I had feared. And I had feared that very strongly since 2016. So I think that is a real possibility. I think there will be countries that go down that way if Brazil doesn't get rid of its own bumbling president, that Brazil will go down that way. Italy may still go down that way, depending on whether Five Star or Salvini capitalize on what's going on. And the U.S., I think, the biggest prize for the right-wing nativistic populists. It could go down that way. But I think if that's the case, that's just laying the scene for the next crisis, which will be an even more existential threat to the health of democracy, and probably we'll see things that we never thought we would see in our lifetimes or in our children's lifetimes, in terms of collapse of institutions and complete change in the trajectory of the West. Second possibility is that we learn the wrong lessons. We emulate China. And I call that sort of a China light strategy, meaning that we take the wrong lesson that all we need is a more authoritarian government. We learned the wrong lesson that China's success came from, silencing civil society, getting rid of constraints. Actually, I think that's quite the opposite. That's where their failures originated from. And we try to emulate China by weakening civil society, weakening democratic institutions, weakening liberty. But then we'll get something much worse than China, because its success actually came not from authoritarianism, but from the competence of the bureaucracy, which is embedded in an authoritarian structure, but it has a history of 2,500 years. And parts of the bureaucracy, despite their subservience to the Communist Party, could have built quite a lot of expertise. And we're not going to do that. So we'll just get the authoritarianism, but we won't get the good parts of it. So it's more like what James and I called in the narrow corridor, a paper leviathan. We continue to fail in understanding the value of state capacity, expertise, technical knowledge, but we just get the authoritarianism. The third is yet another dystopic outcome, I think, which is corporations rise at the expense of the state. So because the state becomes so disqualified and disreputed with its failures, that people turn to corporations and give them even more power. So the US government cannot do anything, but perhaps Apple and Google can help us. And we give up our privacy, we give up our protections, but we get more and more of the dominance of a few companies. And I think that is also not a future that many people will want. And that's why I said Europe has a very important leadership there. I think Europe has been, despite its failure, despite its governance miscoordination and everything, has been at the forefront of protecting privacy. I think GDPR was a great idea. It has failed. I don't think it has achieved any of its objectives, but at least as a reaffirmation of values, it was great. And it has been at the forefront of antitrust policy, which has been very important in this global economy. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think that the European role here is very, very important. But I think the fourth one is the future that I think within grasp, but it's not an easy one by any means, that we realize that we require much better social safety net, much better social expertise, and greater trust in institutions to be earned. That doesn't get given, it gets earned. So that's a process. And we need to actually increase the responsibilities on the shoulders of governments, because we are dealing with truly global complex problems, and this is not going to be the last one. Look, how is that going to work? I think the way that's going to work, if it's going to work at all, and that's why it's not an easy outcome, is that we need to strengthen state institutions and their ability to deal with these problems, including pandemics, but other ones too, including inequality, globalization, and so on. But at the same time, we have to strengthen our democratic institutions so they are on a par with these strengthened Leviathan. Look, I'll give you one example of what I want. What I mean here. Before this crisis, I was probably at the extreme of thinking privacy was very important, and that terrorist threat or no terrorist threat, you really have to rein in institutions like the NSA, the UK or the European equivalents, CIA, and protect individuals, because that's actually vital for the durability of democratic institutions. But in the midst of this pandemic, I have no time for people who say, and I know many computer scientists who say that, for example, who say, oh, you cannot have tracing because that would be a violation of privacy. That's exactly the wrong way to think about it. Of course, during this pandemic, when potentially hundreds of thousands of people more can die in the United States, you have to suspend all of these issues and deal with the pandemic. There's no other way, but you have to do that together with a renewed and credible commitment to even stronger institutional safeguards and even stronger privacy once the crisis is over. And there is only one way of doing that. That's actually doubling down on democracy, strengthening society's commitment to get involved in politics, kick people like Trump out of office, and keep the next generation of politicians, whichever party they are from, much more in check and much more on their tiptoes.